Did you ever snoop through your parents' things as a child and absolutely regret what you found to this day? What was it and did they ever find out? My dad's journal from before I was born. He was so incredibly depressed. He talked about how my older sister cried on her way to kindergarten, and it was the first time he'd been able to relate to her in years. Totally broke my heart. I've never told him though. That was definitely not meant for me to read. I wasn't snooping, but when I was about 14 I was helping mom do laundry like I usually did on Saturdays when I was a kid. I went to put away my dad's shirts and found a Costco-sized box of condoms. It was nearly full. On that didn't bother me. I knew what sex was and figured my parents did it. The troublesome bit was the following Saturday when I was helping with laundry and saw 3 condoms in the drawer instead of 24. I mean, damn guys, it's been a week. My parents got divorced when my dad was caught cheating on my mom. After the divorce I went to visit my dad-in-law when I was about 13. I decided to snoop through his bin of floppy disks and found a very long story he had typed out during the divorce. In it he describes graphic sexual acts with the new woman. How his life would be easier if my mom was to suddenly drop dead. Specifically that he would fantasize about the police showing up at his door to tell him my mom was killed in a car accident. I also learned how his AOL name that he'd been using for years is actually just an inside joke between him and his now wife about the length of his dick. He still uses that name to this day. He did find out that I saw it, and he explained that at the time of the divorce he was seeing a therapist who told him to write the story. I think it was meant for the therapist to read and gain some insight into what my dad was going through. Unfortunately, yes, my dad's father was a fighter pilot during WI. Immediately after the war, he was still flying for the Air Force when he crashed his plane into a mountain and died on his way home from a training mission. My dad had a bunch of artifacts from the wreckage, small things that they could bring off the mountain. It took 2 weeks of searching to find the wreckage and 5 days of hiking up the mountain to get there, which he got after his mom passed away. I was 14. A couple of years later, I wanted to show the artifacts to a friend. Went in my dad's closet to find them, but what I found instead was a 12-inch long, thick, black dildo. I immediately closed the bag it was in and never went looking for the artifacts again. However, a few years later, I was about 20 and dating this guy. My parents were out of town for the weekend, so he was staying over at my house. He thought of himself as a musician and asked if we could record him singing and playing guitar. So, I got out the video recorder and, not wanting to record over anything important, I played the tape that was in it to be sure. It was a homemade sex tape my parents made. I about died. Thankfully I didn't actually see them doing it because it was right at the beginning, still fully clothed, making out on their bed. I noped out of that real quick. Never did record him singing, which is fine cause he sucked. When I was a kid there were no such thing as cell phones and we didn't have magazines, so going to the bathroom was pretty boring. One way I used to entertain myself was by playing with a round piece of rubber that sat in the medicine cabinet. I would poke it, stretch it, spin it on my finger. Wasn't until several years later during sex ed that it suddenly dawned on me that I had been playing with my mother's diaphragm that whole time. After my dad passed away I found some letters sent to him from his family that dated 40 years ago requesting him to marry his distant cousin so they can keep the family blood pure. He was 32 and she was 11. Side note, Middle Easterns have this weird thing with marrying underage girls who also are your distant/close cousins. I found other letters from his relatives saying that they are cutting ties from him because he refused to marry and that he is no longer welcomed in the country. They had the power to blacklist him. My dad ran away shortly after the first letter that I mentioned and met my mom, who's Bulgarian, who's also 2 years younger than him, and got married. Honestly, I'm just proud of him. Not as a child, but as an adult. And it's not gonna be NSFW, just sad. I was spending a few days over to my mom's house in the countryside and she was cleaning up some of her stuff. I stumbled upon a diary that dated back to 1992 when I was barely a year old. I was curious, so I asked her if I could read it. She said yes, but warned me that I might not like what she had written in it at the time. I went ahead and read it anyway. And what I learned was that my father never cared much for me, even back then. He'd still do drugs and smoke pot with me in the next room, and let mom pay for everything pertaining to my needs. I brought the diary to my mom, and asked her if my father ever loved me at all, her diary still in my hand. She sat me down, and confessed that, when she was pregnant with me, she knew she wanted to have me, but my father never did. What I regret is having the absolute certainty that one of my parents never did love me. Before, there was always a sliver of hope, but now, I know my father never really loved me. When I was about 15 we moved from one town to another. While moving somehow some photographs fell out of the back of the drawer that my sister, 3 years older, and I were lifting out of the van. Our hands were full, and we both looked at those photographs spread on the sidewalk. Pictures of our mother with a dog leash on her neck and panties with a hole in which her bleep peeked through. Also more hardcore porn pictures of the woman that we call mom. We looked at each other not sure what to do, and proceeded to get that drawer inside. When we got back out the pictures had gone. Our mom/dad must have picked it up. Or the neighbor? Anyway no word was ever spoken about it. Even my seasoned I never did. Oh my god, yes. I was 8. Wasn't really snooping through my parents' stuff, but our family photo albums. Particularly with mine, and my siblings as babies. First, I got to my brother's. It was so colorful and bright, and filled with notes written by my mom. Same with my little sisters. Then I got to mine. It was boring to say the least. Just plain pictures with no notes or stickers or whatsoever. Then I got to the last page. I remember the exact verbatim of what I read in this small piece of blue sticky paper written by my mom. Is there any more I can say? No. Because we really wanted a baby girl. An 8-year-old boy bawled that day. When I was little I always liked going in my parents' closet. Their closet is above the garage, so it is massive. There aren't any windows, so I liked going there during the day, to be in the dark. They kept a lot of random stuff in the very back, so I always thought it was fun to go through. It wasn't until it got around Christmas time, when my parents said I was not allowed to go in their closet anymore, which naturally made me want to go in there even more. I waited until they were distracted with something and went in. I went to the very back where I like to explore, and found a bunch of wrapped Christmas presents. A few weeks later I got those same presents but from Santa. This really confused me as an 8-year-old. Why would Santa bring the gifts early, just to have to come back later to out them out on Christmas Eve? I guess it must make it easier and definitely would make the sleigh lighter. My dad always acted like he was dirt poor, even though I knew otherwise. He would always have an excuse to not go somewhere, or to do stuff with me, and my brother, that had him spending money. Well one day my dad and brother went to the store, so I snuck in his computer room, and went through his filing cabinet. There were his bank records and sure enough he had over 50k in the bank just collecting interest. He'd take 1 week out of the year, and go on vacation, but it would only be him, and whoever he was dating. Never once took my brother and I. Always left me heartbroken knowing that my dad would rather make excuses than to spend time with his own kids. On a side note, after I found the bank's records I snooped through his computer and found all the porn sites he was paying for. This is a little different. I wasn't exactly going through my parents' stuff, but through their emails, because I was trying to find some pictures from years ago. I found an email from my mum to my ballet teacher I was suicidal from when I was 9. And it was an email detailing why I was being bullied to the point of not wanting to live anymore, and how it made my mum question everything she had ever done or said to me. For a bit of context, I had just had a meltdown about how I hated school and wanted to stab myself with a kitchen knife to get away from what I was feeling. It was very surreal to read it. I can remember going through it, but that email just screamed despair to me, and I wanted to hug my mum really tight. I regret reading it, because it made me feel like I did back then. I don't care if this gets buried, I just wanted to share what I'm feeling right now. I found hentai in my mum's room when I was 13, and I watched it out of curiosity. I was like, why does this cartoon look like it might be a porn? Anyway, I found out I like hentai, but I don't really like knowing that my mom gets off to the same flavor of stuff as me. Sometimes that still pops up in my brain, and I got to forcefully repress. My mom never found out I watched her VHS hentai. I think it was called Adventure Kid, something like that. I think I was actually in there looking for Macupe. She wouldn't let me buy Macupe, so I used to steal hers. I found my paranoid schizophrenic father's diary full of rants, including him accusing my mother of adultery and her denials. It was just so sad and messed up, a really awful peek inside his mind. I knew he was sick, but to get that honest a look inside was far too much for a 10-year-old. I admitted to my mother what I found. When I went back to look at the notebook another time, I saw she dripped out all the pages. We'd run away from him years before. I have no idea why she kept the thing. I was fixing my father's computer as a teenager. It was filled with a ton of spyware and viruses. I decided to go through his massive folder of porn to find out what sites he was visiting that was giving him so many problems. The early 2000s were a dangerous time. In there, I found a bunch of nudes and pictures of an old woman, at least in her 60s, engaged in various sex acts with my father. I wondered who it was, so I went into his email account with the password I made for him and found out he met a woman on Adult Friend Finder and was living with her when he was supposed to be traveling for work. I also found out that he had a gun, which is scary since my father was abusive towards me for most of my life. I told my mom because my mom is awesome AF and deserves to know. She was happy because she hated him and couldn't leave him because she would be fucked financially. He found out when my mom told him to get out of the house and go back to fucking his grandma. My mom used to make dolls out of used pantyhose. It was a thing in the 80s. A creepy thing. But it happened. Think Cabbage Patch premise but out of pantyhose. I found one in her closet in a box. I found one in her closet once. It was a man with a fake fur beard and an enormous DCK, like enormous. I'd never seen one in real life, so it caused me much anxiety. Also realizing mom was making naked man dolls. For what reason? Why, mom? Why? I found a CD in their room that was just white. There wasn't any writing on it or anything. Being the stupid child that I was, I went to put it in our family DVD player anyways. I realize now that what I had watched for a few seconds was actually a porn video. Parents walked in and yelled at me and my sister. I asked what the people were doing on TV. My parents replied with, wrestling, and shut it off. I found my mom's journal from around the time I was conceived. I got to read about her feelings for my father, how she wished I was a boy, and her slow heartbreak when my father cut her/us out of his life, and then the slow bitterness at me being around. I regret reading it, because while I knew I was an accidental baby, I didn't realize how much I wasn't what my mother wanted. I won't ever tell her I read it though, but I still think about it 20 years later. It wasn't my parents, but a friend of mine's parents. His mom was a math teacher. She was short and round. We went over to his house, and he said, I need to show you what I found, so hell yeah, we were in, and wanted to see. He takes us to his parents' room and the closet has a padlock on it, but they mounted it with the screws exposed, so all you had to do to break in was take the screws out. He takes out the screws and opens the door and immediately goes to a big paper grocery sack. You know when you go get fast food and the fries are greasy and soak through the bag? It was like that, but was a full-sized grocery bag that had something in it that was obviously too long to lay flat on the bottom of the bag. You could see the shape of something pushing against the side of the bag about 3 or 4 inches from the bottom. Now I don't know why he grabbed it barehanded, but he opens the bag and pulls out a hand-carved dildo that was the length and diameter of my forearm. It looked like a short baseball bat with a massive sewing machine motor on it for the vibration. It was coated in what looked like really thick lube, like Crisco consistency. This lady was my 7th and 8th grade math teacher. I could never look at her the same way again. Not exactly as a child, but after I went to college my parents rearranged and put their old bed in my room. It was the type that had a lot of drawers for storage under it, and they were filled with extra winter clothes. One day I was home on break and looking for some mittens or something and found a letter that my mom's ex-boyfriend wrote to her when he heard she was moving in with my dad. It was all weird rambling nice guy bullshit, where he tries to pose as sensitive and poetic, while also letting her know that he was bitter because she refused to live with him when they were dating, and that he hoped it didn't work out between her and my dad. I don't know much about their relationship, but at the time the letter was written they must have been broken up for years, and she was living in a different state. Also, when I was stalked by an ex, she did mention that she could relate, and I think she was talking about him. So obviously not a good dude, no matter how much he loved moonlit bicycle rides in the desert, or whatever. I have no idea why she kept it, since to get in this drawer it must have been packed up, moved, and unpacked many times. But for the record, my parents have been married for nearly 30 years, and are still going strong. So fuck you random dude. A little late, but I hope someone sees this, so they can share my horror. I was laying on the bed with my parents when I saw what I thought was strawberry squeeze candy. They tried to tell me not to worry about it, but I thought they were just hiding some sweet candy from me and not sharing, so I used my finger to try a little bit from the top. Took me a couple years to realize I ate my parents' fucking loop straight from the applicator, and it makes me die inside every time I remember. Not really something I regret, but when I was younger I was snooping around my grandmother's room and found all of the paperwork about my dad's murder. It was a stack of papers that listed who all was involved, what they found in my dad's car, and statements from witnesses. I remember thinking it was really interesting and reading through a few pages before taking them and hiding them in my closet.